Hello, friends, and welcome to the show. I'm glad to have you on board. Greg Koukl here. We got Jason's on board from San Francisco. I was going to do a lot of open mic calls today. I had some in the queue I want to get to, but let's get to Jason first. So, Jason, welcome to Stand to Reason. Glad you called.
Thank you, Greg.
You're welcome.
I have a question about why it is that believers will not sin in heaven.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that there are two primary views on this issue, and both of them rely on God doing something to human beings to ensure that we don't sin. But on one view, he just removes our sinful nature, and we are theoretically capable of choosing sin in heaven, but it's just ensured that as a matter of fact, we never will. Whereas on the other view, God not only removes our sinful nature, but he infuses us with his moral perfection, like that divine attribute.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that you take that latter view, that God shares with us of his moral perfection.
Mm-hmm.
And I would like to believe that view of the two due to theological and apologetic problems with the other view.
So,
but I'm curious,
yeah,
why do you believe, and here's my sticking point, why do you think that the divine property of moral perfection is a communicable property?
Okay.
Like some properties are clearly communicable and others are not. So
Yes.
this one here is just, I'm not sure why we would think it one way or the other.
Okay. Well, if God does change our natures to be morally perfect, then ipso facto, moral perfection, a divine quality, is communicable, because that's what's happening there. So that's the nature of one of the options, that God communicates that attribute to people in the resurrection, all right? The other view, as you pointed out, and Clay Jones takes this other view. I mean, I've been with him when he's taught on it, and that is that we will not have an inclination to sin, I guess, and I don't want to misrepresent him, but it's something of this sort. We will not have an inclination to sin like we do now in our fallen nature, but we will be more like Adam. Okay? Now, the way that is, he's morally innocent, no fallen nature, no inclination. Now, the way you put it, though, and just so I understand you correctly, you said that God, in both cases, we will not be able to sin, but in both cases, God does something, but he does one of two things. Okay, so I'm asking the question, what is it that, well, I think the way you put it is God does something to ensure that there will be no sin in heaven. So,
right.
So if it's the first option, what is it that ensures that a human being without a sin nature, as in the case of Adam, will not use his moral freedom that would still be intact on that view, the moral freedom in this case being the ability to sin or not to sin, the ability to do otherwise kind of thing. What is it that God does to secure the fact that we will never use that moral freedom to sin on the first option?
Well, there's two different areas. And one, they'll say that not only that we're not actually returning to just Adam's state, but it is, we'll be glorified, so it'll be a higher state. But I know Clay Jones really banks on the idea that part of why we will not choose to sin is because we have seen how disastrous the effects are of sin. And so basically it's like now, as Paul says, I want to do good, but there's this evil present. And so once that sinful nature is removed from us, we will always be able to choose the good. Kind of like I heard J.P. Moreland say, which I think he adopts this view. He said, I could choose to go eat my dog's feces. Like that's theoretically possible. He goes, but I would never choose to do that. And in heaven, that was his analogy. It's like theoretically sin would still be possible because we would still have moral freedom, but without the sinful nature there to ever incline us toward that, and knowing how disgusting sin is, nobody will ever choose it. So that at the end of the day, you end up with sinlessness either way. But sin is still theoretically possible. And that's why I think the view that you hold is preferable. But if I were to defend it, somebody challenged me and said, well, but why do you think that property is something God could communicate? Like, clearly God can't communicate his omniscience to us, but he can communicate his immortality to us. So what reasons are there to think that, apart from theological advantages of that view for why we won't sin, what reasons are there to think that the divine property of moral perfection is something God could give to us? And then that invites a second question. If he could give this to us, why didn't he do so from the very beginning?
Okay, two separate questions. And actually, I think the first question, the burden of proof, is going in the wrong direction, okay? Because if it seems like there is no good reason in the nature of the thing itself that the attribute could not be communicated, then I don't know why I have to argue that I want to be careful how I say this, that the default position isn't that it's not communicated unless I can give a good reason that it is communicated, okay? Obviously, omniscience is not something that a finite creature can participate in, but immortality is something like that. It seems to me that moral purity, essential. I'm trying to think about how to characterize the attribute now, but that kind of thing, God's essential goodness, his moral perfection, there it is not the kind of thing that can't be communicated. So I don't have a reason to doubt it, and I do have a strong characterization, and we all share this understanding that there will not be sin in heaven. So I don't see why I would have to have that I'm not entitled to that as a legitimate option. Okay, because it's certainly possible. So why not? Now, my sense, I could be wrong on this, and I haven't talked to JP about this. In fact, I was supposed to interview him today, but we had a mess up in schedule, so on another issue. But and I'm not sure where Clay is on this, but I have heard his characterization, and in the way he's put it, his illustrations look at. I wouldn't stick myself in the eye with a stick right now because that'd be stupid. And so, in the same way, based on what I know, as you characterized, I wouldn't sin in heaven because that would be stupid. Okay. Now, to me, I understand his point, but that is not nearly a robust enough assurance for me regarding heaven. Okay. That I know better. And since I'm not fallen, and I'm glorified. Now, I'm not sure what glorification, the difference it's going to make to my will. I know the difference it makes to my body. But to me, part of the glorification package is moral perfection. But on this alternate view, moral perfection is not part of glorification, but you suggested glorification does something to strengthen our moral capabilities so that we won't sin. I'm not sure what to call that. I don't know why we shouldn't just call that moral perfection, except for one reason. Because, and this is not surprising if this is what's driving JP and I think Clay, and that is moral freedom, or at least their understanding of moral freedom. Now, it's interesting that I've over the years, in being under JP's teaching and stuff, he's a very strong advocate of libertarian freedom. And over the years, though, he has talked about different aspects of freedom. And one aspect of freedom is not just in the strict libertarian sense, fulfilling the CDO condition, like could have done otherwise. So freedom means not just by my agency, I do what I want. That would be a lesser standard. But rather the CDO condition is I can do what I want, or I could have actually done otherwise, So I think that they want to sustain this sense of they could have done otherwise, but I won't choose to. I could do otherwise, but I won't choose to.
Right.
In order to maintain a robust sense of moral freedom. But at other times, when he's talked about freedom, he said freedom is sometimes the ability to do something that you learn to do that had you not invested in developing the skill, you wouldn't be free to do. So I don't have the freedom to play the piano because I never learned. But a person who put the time in to practice and all of that, on infinitum. Now they can do this wonderful stuff. They have a freedom to accomplish something different. So in that sense, the freedom to do the good is still a bona fide freedom. And that's where I see it. The scripture says, when we see him, we will be like him because we will see him as he is. Now, I guess that kind of leaves some room for, what does he mean by that? But it is not a stretch for us to understand that statement as entailing his moral nature, his moral perfections that we get. Now, will we have the freedom to sin? No, that's not bad. That's good. We will have the same freedom that God has,
Right.
the freedom not to sin. And that is a much more, that's a much, richer sense of freedom.
Right.
So
Right.
if it, so I'm with you. I mean, if it communicates, if there is a communicable quality of God, moral perfection, I'm there. I want that. And frankly, if it's a jump ball between the options, the rationale, I'm going to go for the one I like. But I actually don't think it's a jump ball. I think that these are kind of like, well, I wouldn't stick myself in the eye with a stick. I get his point. It's just not compelling to me. Why don't we just say, no, we will be like him. We will be glorified, and glorification entails moral perfection. And classically, it's been characterized as non posse peccari. It is not possible to sin. So we start out posse peccari, Adam, it's possible to sin. Then it's non posse non peccari. That means it's not possible not to sin in the fallen state. And then it's going to be non posse peccari. We were able to sin in the first case. Now we can't not sin, and now we're not going to be able to sin. And that's the classic way of putting it. And even if I get my Latin terms mixed up a little bit, you get the point, okay?
Yeah.
Because that's my Latin, along with et tu, Brute. All right, that covers the basis for me. Or tempus fugit. My dad used to say tempus is fidgeting. Time is flying. Anyway, I think that there's a certain kind of what am I looking for? Kind of balanced there. There's an elegance to that. And I think it's certainly, you could conclude that from the scriptures that talk about that. And it just strikes me that God attributing that quality to us, communicating his moral perfection to us, is a lot simpler. If we're just going with a kind of a parsimony here and an Occam's razor, it's just easier than saying, well, I'll still be able to sin, but I won't choose to because I don't want to stick myself in the eye with a stick because that's dumb. And I see all this other stuff. I have absolutely no confidence in myself. Now, maybe I'm just reflecting on my fallenness here, which I wouldn't have, but I have no confidence that that's robust enough to keep me safe in heaven, much less the multitude that will be sharing heaven with me. And so, I don't know.
Well, speaking of the multitude who are sharing heaven, that multitude would include not just humans, but we also have the angels. So how would you, because if God has to infuse us with his attribute of moral perfection to ensure that we don't sin in heaven, what about the angels?
Yeah, well, we don't know what their circumstances are. We know what it used to be.
Do you think that God will do something similar? Because, they've rebelled at least, if Michael Heiser's right, 3, if not 4 more times that they have rebelled over the years.
Correct.
Of different rebellions. So, they saw how bad things were. They've seen the consequences, and yet still more sin. So would something comparable have to be done to the angels to ensure that there is literally no sin in heaven among any of God's creation?
Well, for one, this is really speculative, and I haven't seen Heiser's treatment of this. God bless his soul, which actually you don't have to pray that anymore. God is blessing his dear soul right now. But he, excuse me, he I don't know how he cashes all that out. And I've only done a kind of a cursory read of his book, The Hidden Realm.
Unseen Realm.
Unseen Realm. There you go. But what's interesting from your comment, though, is it does raise another issue. If there have been multiple falls, and I don't know what the evidence of, then that shows that just knowing what happened in the first fall isn't enough from dissuading people who are capable of rebelling
Right.
again from doing so. So that actually weakens that argument, it strikes me. I don't know the status of the rest of the angels. Maybe as a reward for their non-rebellion, then God will change their natures. We know almost nothing about angels. I mean, compared to the big story and all the other details of theology and human whatever. And I mean, we could probably know more than we do know because there's more revealed, and this is part of Heiser's project. But I don't know. I can't answer that. But I not just like the idea of the safety of God's moral perfection, but I think that is a grander glorification.
Yeah, I agree.
I don't. Maybe that's not the right way to put it, but it's just, and I think this is going to be like, in Thai they say DT suit, which means the best. It's good, the best. DT suit, man, and that's what it's going to be. And when I get to heaven, I want the best. I don't want to just be okay. Now you're fixed up pretty good. Don't screw it up, again.
Right.
And I think actually JP's kind of grotesque, unseemly illustration, it seems to support my view a little bit more, because he will not do what he suggested, though in a sense he's physical possible, because he has no desire to do this, no intention to this. Nothing in him desires that. And to me, that is the status of moral perfection. God can do whatever he wants, but everything he wants is going to be good because of his nature. And I think we will be in the same circumstance because we'll be like Jesus. We can do whatever we want, but everything we want is going to be good. Our natures are going to be changed. And I mean, that's my conviction and my reason. I could be mistaken about this. I think we all agree there's not going to be any sin in heaven, but and whether that's a result of communicable property or some other miracle that God does in us, the nature of glorification, it doesn't matter to me as long as we don't do it. Nobody does it, which seems to be the case. I mean, this is the description of heaven moving into eternity, which actually is a misnomer because nobody lives an eternity. We just live forever and ever. We'll always have an age. Anyway, that's another issue.
So going back to the angel thing, the angel kind of works against both positions. It's against what I call the inoculation view of Jones, in the sense that if angels saw rebellion and yet more angels still rebelled after that, then what's to say that we, even after having experienced sin, wouldn't choose the same?
Yeah.
But then it works against the God communicating his nature to us, in the sense that if it's necessary for us to have his moral perfection to stop sinning, it's like, then how could it not be necessary for the angels to experience the exact same thing?
Yeah, see,
we're not told that angels will be glorified, unless you just say, well, we're not told much about angels at all, so it could be the case that God will glorify them, even though Scripture is silent on the issue.
Yeah, but the second concern that you raised, I don't think is a problem for me, because I'm not making the claim that angels could never sin. And if even, have multiple rebellions, I don't know, if are you convinced that I'm not debating you now, but are you convinced the textual evidence for multiple rebellions is pretty good from your reading of Heiser?
It's a mix of textual, but yeah, I do think it's probably likely that it wasn't all at once.
Okay.
There was different beings rebelling at different times. So
okay,
yeah,
got it. Okay, fine. But nevertheless, you still have in these multiple rebellions, there is no claim that angels are somehow given the quality of moral perfection. It just, all we know is a lot of them stayed good. But we don't know that they stayed good in virtue of moral perfection, and we don't know they're going to stay good in the future in virtue of moral perfection. Now, it does seem that once this age is done, that the possibility of any rebellion of any sort is going to be gone. It's not going to happen. And this is like, I mean, you have this sense of finality there in Revelation 20, and the beast and the man of perdition and the devil and everybody whose name was not written in the book of life. They were all once and for all thrown into the lake of fire. Okay, and then we move in to 21 and 22, and this characterization of the new heavens and the new earth, and even with all the obviously metaphoric characterizations there, it's really clear there is no darkness. All the foul things are outside the gate, right? So inside this kingdom where God is, there's all that bad stuff from the past is gone. Now the question then could be asked, well, then how are the angelic beings preserved if their last state didn't serve them, didn't result in them being unable to rebel? How is it this future state is? And to me, that's a good place to say, well, probably because they are then also transformed into with moral perfection as a communicable property, just like humans are, and that secures the whole thing. So,
right.
But that's speculation with regards to the angels.
Right.
We don't know their status even now with regards to that.
We have very little knowledge about the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, I know just in light of time, I don't rush you, but I know that last question about if God did create, or if he can communicate to us that divine property of moral perfection.
Oh, why didn't he do that in the beginning?
Why? Yeah, why create us with just moral innocence when he could have done so with moral perfection?
Yeah.
And this is where I think the inoculation view has the upper hand, because it's basically, well, God couldn't have created us that way from the beginning with we're ensuring we couldn't sin because we first had to have the experience of it and learn how bad it is so that we then, in the future, when our sinful inclinations are removed from us, then we will always and only choose the good.
Sure. So that's an outworking of a certain kind of theodicy, right? Of why would God allow evil? Okay, and I think there is something there, but I don't land in the same spot, because we do have to answer that question. It comes up all the time. Well, if God could have made us the way we'll be in heaven, according to my view, then why didn't he do it in the beginning? And this is where I'm just going to leverage some things that I learned from JP. All right, and what JP says is that this life is where where God is preparing us to be fit to spend eternity with him. Now he didn't cash that out, but I thought it was a clever way of putting it, because there are texts that indicate that what we do in this life has an impact, or is determinative of something about, let's just call it, the quality of existence that we experience after the resurrection. And there are I can think of two texts right off the top of my head that indicate this. One is in Hebrews chapter 11, where all these people who are saved from hardship and difficulty and harm and all this by faith. So here's all this victory by faith. But then there's a lot of defeat that is endured by faith. That's the famous "and others" twist that you get halfway through. And others didn't fare so well, And the reason it says is that so that they might secure a better resurrection. A better resurrection. Wow. How can you have a better resurrection? Well, some people are resurrected in a form that is better than others. That's what it seems to mean on face value. Now, you got another passage in 1 Timothy that says, we were just talking about this as a team today, or maybe even I were talking about it. And it says, Paul says, physical exercise profits little. Okay, there's some profit of pumping iron, right? But in the big picture, it's minor because it's limited to this life. Then he says, godliness is a means of great gain, not only for this life, like pumping iron, but also for the life to come. So there is something going on here that is a this life is a place where we are schooled for, we'll just call it eternity, even though we don't live and eternity, just forever and ever. So you get my point. So we're schooled for that. And that means just as there are greater sins and more punishment for different people in hell, that's clear from Jesus' comments, there are also different qualities of experience and existence in eternity, in heaven, based on what happens here. So what I've argued but this is all somewhat speculative, and that's the way theodicies are. Theodicies being, for those who don't know, characterizations of why God would have allowed evil. Well, why would he allow evil in the world? What would be a good reason? Well, there's a number of possibilities, and some of them overlap. And what I'm offering now is what's called a soul-making theodicy. In other words, God is using evil in our lives to accomplish things that in our souls could not be accomplished if we didn't live in a fallen world. So how are you going to develop the quality of long-suffering if there's no suffering? Or the quality of forgiving those who offend you if there's nothing to forgive because the world's not fallen? Just to give two examples. So this world then, and by the way, I've been influenced by JP on this thinking, and it really has had a profound impact on the way I look at my sanctification, for lack of a better word. I don't like using that word. Though it's a biblical word. I think it's one of those worn out Christian words, and it ceases to communicate. But I think what God is doing is he's working us out here with all these things. Momentary light affliction is producing for us an eternal way to glory. 2 Corinthians 4 there. And so Paul, that verb is really important. It's the difficulties that are resulting in. No difficulties, no result is the idea there. And so, I think that God he wants to make us more like him in experience, and that takes a fallen world. It also takes a fallen world for God to be able to express his glorious quality of justice and wrath against evil. Okay, so I don't say that's the only factor, and that makes some people sit up and go, wait a minute, that sounds weird. No, wait, God's just. Hell is a good place. What? Well, did God make it? Yes. Does God make bad things or good things? Everything God made is good. It's a good place because a good thing gets done there. It is not a fun place. It is not subjectively pleasant for those who go there, but it accomplishes a good purpose. Okay? And so God's goodness is manifest in his judgment of evil. And that wouldn't be the case if there was no evil. There would be no one to see. We would not be able to behold that aspect of God's character because there would not have been any evil for that aspect of his character to be manifest against, to deal with. Anyway, so those are some ideas, and I'm not roosting on any of them. I have written on some, but they are conjecture, and we just have to be careful because we're not sure. But here's some thoughts. Here's some ways that it might have worked out, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So there you have it.
Well, lots to think about. Thank you. I appreciate that.
All right, Jason, good talking to you, and I'm glad you brought this up. We've talked like 3/4 of the show already, and it was fun. All right, buddy.
Thank you.
All right, take care.
All right, goodbye.
Bye-bye. All right, let's take a break, and then we'll do an open mic call about the book of Proverbs and some things in there that have to do with arguing for your points. All right, friends, we're going to, let's see, where is that? I wanted to say something about our prior conversation because I thought of it, but I didn't recall it in time to say it in the last segment, and now it's come back. And that is on the view that we are still capable of sinning, but we are not going to sin. That is a view that establishes our sinlessness in heaven as an accidental property. In other words, it just so happens that we're not going to do that. And there might be a way, in a certain sense, to secure that because we really won't want to, or because we saw how bad, whatever it is. But it's going to be an accidental property. It's not going to be built into our new natures. But if God shares his attribute of holiness with us, if he communicates that to us so that we experience, we have his moral perfection, not just as a property, but as part of our being, that sounds better to me. I don't know how to put it. Of course, we talked about that too. That sounds better. It's me that's rescued so completely that it's just not accidentally there. Like it'll just happen to be that we never do that, maybe for some good reason, but because, but rather because now we are completely different in that regard. All right. I want to be better than Adam. A whole lot. All right, let's hear what Mark Johnson has to say here about Proverbs.
Hey, good morning, Greg. My question is in Proverbs 20, verse 3. Also Proverbs 19:11, 17:14, and 15:18. Talks about not having strife, don't create arguing, but as an apologist, we do set forth arguments, and I run into Christians that, well, I mean, I'm a Christian, I follow Christ, but I run into other Christians that are kind of anti-apologetic, and they say we're not supposed to argue, or they really push back. Can you give me some biblical explanation, some defense that I can talk with other people about when that subject comes up? I appreciate it. My name's Mark, and I live in the middle of Ohio, and I'm a fisherman.
Wow.
Have a good day.
There you go, Mark. Well, maybe we'll stretch a line sometime. I'm not sure. And Ohio's got some good fishing, too. What's very interesting to me is that you have friends from whom, as you put it, you've received some pretty aggressive pushback on the issue of having arguments with other people like we do when we're making our case. And you have a string of verses here from Proverbs, which I suspect some of those you got from the people who pushed back. So what exactly was going on there? Here were these people who were, after a fashion, arguing with you and giving reasons for their view why arguing is not a good idea. Notice you can't avoid this, all right? And you can't avoid it because it's a feature of our mental life that is important to finding out what the truth is. Now, I understand that the word argue can have different senses. A person writes a book and advances an argument, all right? If all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. There's an argument. Or there might be an argument pertaining to an ethical issue or some theological issue or whatever. The difficulty with claiming, for example, from Proverbs, and we'll read those in just a moment, or from any other text, that arguing as a blanket statement is wrong, is that all of the biblical writers did it, including Jesus. All the biblical individuals Jesus didn't write. But they all did it. They all argued in a certain fashion. And sometimes those arguments were intense. Sometimes they were heated. Think of Paul in Galatians, chapter 2, and he goes after Peter for good reason, quite aggressively. Jesus, in many occasions, confronted the religious leaders in an aggressive fashion. And he did a lot of it with questions so he could trick them. Not trick them in a bad way, but trick them in a right way. Have them fall into their own pit, so to speak. When you read in the book of Acts, say 16, 17, 18, you'll see a number of references to Paul arguing with people. And then it says, and some were persuaded. So if we have friends that are just saying arguing is wrong and are not careful to clarify, then the question I'm going to ask is, if it's wrong, then why did Jesus do it? And all of those people who he trained to follow after him, why did they do it too? Well, they did it because it wasn't wrong. Now, there are wrong ways to engage in controversial issues. And at Stand to Reason, characteristically, we are trying to teach you those proper ways as a good ambassador to argue for the truth. And in fact, if you are not allowed to argue for the truth, then you're not going to be able to find what the truth is or defend the truth against lies. Now, in Chapter 2 of Tactics, I go into some detail on this. And people say, well, you can't argue people into the kingdom. Yes, you can. It happens all the time. J. Warner Wallace, just off the top of my head. Lee Strobel, just off the top of my head. Names familiar to all of you. They were argued into the kingdom. It were the facts of the matter that persuaded them, or maybe to be more theologically precise, it was the facts of the matter that the Holy Spirit used to persuade them that Christianity was true. All right. So there's nothing wrong with those, with having an argument, if what you mean by an argument is a point of view that is defended by reasons. And that, by the way, is what an argument is. It's not just a point of view. That's an assertion. If you make assertion and give the reasons why you think the assertion is true, now you have an argument. Now, it doesn't mean your assertion is true. Then you have to look at see how the argument plays itself out and if it works, if the argument goes through, so to speak. But it's going to be based on reasons. Now, that process can be done in a genial fashion or in an extremely hostile fashion, okay? And it is the hostile thing that's the problem. When Peter says to defend the faith in 1 Peter chapter 3, he says, always be ready to give an answer for everyone who asks you to make a defense for the hope that is within you, yet with gentleness and reverence. Notice the verse doesn't stop there. Yet with gentleness and reverence. So make the case, make the point, give the reasons, but be careful how you do that. And it's in lots of places. First, make that 2 Timothy chapter 2, last verse of 2 Timothy chapter 2. Listen to this. Actually, it's the last 3 verses. The Lord's bondservant must not, now it doesn't say argue. It says must not be quarrelsome. You know, there's a difference between making a case and quarreling. The Lord's bondservant must not be quarrelsome, but kind to all, able to teach, patient when wronged, and with gentleness correcting those who are in opposition. And then adds, if perhaps God may grant them repentance leading to the knowledge of the truth. So we are trusting in God to make a difference, but we are careful in how we present it, all right? So the concern that Paul is raising with Timothy is not engagement, but how we engage, not being quarrelsome. And actually, when you go back to those other texts that Mark mentioned in the book of Proverbs, this is precisely what we find. Now, he might have mentioned this when we were talking, but let me just read it again. Proverbs 20, verse 3, that's his first one. Keeping away from strife is an honor for a man, but any fool will quarrel. Notice what's being abraded there is quarreling that creates strife. It is not arguing per se. And keep in mind, now I'm using the word argue, not as a synonym for quarreling, creating strife, but case making, which is the issue with apologetics. We're making a case. We're making an argument, but we're not quarreling, or we want to avoid that, because that just causes strife. All right, what was the next verse that he raised? Okay, that was, let me look it up here. Proverbs 19:11, just the page before it. What does that say? A man's discretion makes him slow to anger, and it is his glory to overlook a transgression. Now, I know this passage because I decided for myself a number of times, and plus I offered it to my eldest daughter when she was younger, having a fight with her sister. But, I'm right, she's wrong. Well, it might be that she was wrong and you're right, but a man's discretion makes him slow to anger, and, by the way, it is his glory to overlook a transgression. So there's certainly a message there. There's counsel that's being given. We learn. It's a good thing for us to say, never mind. Let it go. Refuse to be offended. We're just going to overlook it, okay? Rather than always pursuing every slight against us. But notice that this has nothing to do with arguing in the sense we're discussing. So neither of these two verses here so far apply to the issue that we're talking about. All right, so let's try another one. Proverbs 17:14. And here's what it says. The beginning of strife is like letting out water. So abandon the quarrel before it breaks out. The beginning of strife is like letting out water, so abandon the quarrel before it breaks out. Now, I have a suspicion about this passage, okay? You realize, of course, that sometimes the biblical writers speak in very earthy terms. And sometimes they're sanitized in the translation. But, Paul says to the Galatians, if you want to impress people by getting circumcised as an evidence of your righteousness, why don't you just go all the way and cut it all off? Now, the way the translation is you mutilate yourself. Okay. But so that's a bit coarse, but he's making a point. Something like that, I think, is going on in here. The beginning of strife is like letting out water. What's letting out water? Well, letting out water is going to the bathroom, number one, to put it simply. So if you start going number one, it's kind of hard to stop. You got to finish it out, right? That's just the way it works. Pardon me, but I'm just reading the scripture. I think that's what he's referring to. And he's using that as a lesson. Just like that's hard to stop, so are arguments. Abandon the quarrel before it breaks out. Now notice here we have the same language as in the first verse, Proverbs 20, verse 3. He is talking about strife and quarreling. He is not talking about case-making. So this passage doesn't disqualify Christian case-making either. What about the final one? Well, that's in Proverbs 15, verse 18. And here's what that verse says. A hot-tempered man stirs up strife, but the slow to anger calms a dispute. Now, incidentally, all these verses that I've cited here in Proverbs, I either have them underlined in pencil or highlighted in yellow. Why? Because these are to instruct me. But these have nothing to do implicitly with case-making. It may have to do with case-making if it turns out you're bringing something else to the table other than your argument. If you're bringing a bad attitude, if you're bringing nastiness, if you're bringing hot temper, if you are stirring up strife in the way that you're comporting yourself, if you're being divisive in the way that you're comporting yourself, if you're quarreling, which is a way of comporting yourself, that's not right, and it's stupid. By the way, the smart and stupid, these are the categories in Proverbs. It's not so much right and wrong. It's smart and stupid. And so the writer of Proverbs is saying, oh, well, you look at it's dumb. You're a hot-tempered guy, you're going to stir up strife, all right? If you are slow to anger, you're going to calm a dispute. Let's be smart when we're trying to make our points. Don't let strife get out of control. It's hard to stop. Abandon the quarrel before it breaks out. Across the page here, I just got another. Sweetness of speech increases persuasiveness. All right, so that ties in. We don't want to quarrel. But we want to be persuasive, so be careful how you talk so that your speech improves the capability of someone being persuaded by your ideas. Proverbs is filled with stuff that's really good. So much of it has to do with the tongue and the way we talk and engage. And since that's a big part of what we teach about here, and I do in my life, this is why I have a lot of these places underlined, because I need this help. But the Bible does not teach we should not argue. Make the case. Jesus did it. The apostles did it. And we ought to do it. But we ought to do it properly. And this is where Proverbs will help us. All right, friends, thank you for spending some time with me today. Greg Koukl here for Stand to Reason. Give them heaven. Bye-bye now.